It's week 10 of the fantasy football season, which means the tough part's behind us, right? That's not the case at all. We have 14 teams on bye over the next 3 weeks of the season. Let's see if we can find anything of value on the waiver wire. That's right, welcome to week 10 of the fantasy football season. Now in today's show, we're going to cover some of the top injuries that just happened last week in week 9, go over 5 things that we learned in week 9, talk about the teams on upcoming bye, and then we're going to dive into the waiver wire and find out, is there anyone out there that can help us the second half of the fantasy football season? But let's go ahead and start off with injuries here first, because like every other week of the NFL season, we have a few big name guys that went down in week 9. How about CeeDee Lamb? He's dealing with a right shoulder injury. Sounds like an AC sprain. Now, typically players will try to play through this injury, but typically also see a dip in production during that time. And if he were to take a big fall on that shoulder again, we could lose him for multiple weeks. But he also may have lost his quarterback as well in Dak Prescott, who's dealing with a hamstring injury and a hand injury. Really a good chance of him not playing in week 10. We could have Cooper Rush under center. Dak Prescott could miss up to the next 2 to 3 weeks. So between the 2 injuries here in Dallas, we got to pay close attention. I know not a lot of people are using Dak Prescott right now, but a lot of people are heavily reliant on CeeDee Lamb. At this point in the fantasy football season, when you're trying to make a run at the playoffs, you need your best players, one of them being CeeDee Lamb. How about Chris Olave? He suffered another concussion in week 9, and we're probably looking at a multi-week absence here. It's his 5th concussion since 2020. The guy has a history of concussions. The New Orleans Saints are an absolute dumpster fire right now. They got players on the trading block. They just lost to the Carolina Panthers. Things are bad in New Orleans. They just fired their head coach. They're not going to rush back Chris Olave. How about Drake London? He's dealing with a right hip injury, and we really need to pay close attention to his practice participation throughout the week here this week. There's a good chance that he plays through this injury. Now, does that mean that over the next couple of weeks, we may see a slight dip in volume going the way of Drake London? Entirely possible. How about Eric All Jr., the rookie tight end in Cincinnati? He suffered a right knee injury. He's torn his ACL. He's done for the year. I know he wasn't really fantasy relevant, but now he makes someone else fantasy relevant that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. How about Caleb Williams? He suffered an ankle injury, but all signs are pointing to it being a minor ankle injury, and he should be able to play through it. And then lastly, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. He suffered a right knee injury. We're really waiting for more test results at this time. Didn't seem to be severe. Kind of estimated an MCL sprain, could be 2 to 6 weeks for A.J. Brown, but we're just waiting for more information to be publicly known, so we kind of know how to handle that situation going forward. So now let's go ahead and move on to 5 things that we learned in week 9 of fantasy football. The first one being, we are getting absolutely spoiled with all of the amazing plays we're seeing on the field each and every week, it seems like. We saw Garrett Wilson on Thursday Night Football this past week make arguably the catch of the year in the end zone. And then we saw Devontae Smith make a ridiculous grab in the back of the end zone. How about Demarcus Robinson winning the game with a crazy one-handed catch? And then how about Saquon Barkley? I have never seen a player hurdle a defender backwards. I mean, these plays were absolutely crazy, but a lot of people will get caught up with a lot of the negatives around the game, right? How about the referees impacting the game, all the flags? I get all that, but when crazy things like this happen, we just need to appreciate it maybe a little bit more. How about the trade deadline could involve some big time names here this season? It's time for some of these bad teams this year to start moving on and making some moves. Some teams maybe like Cleveland, Tennessee, New Orleans. I mean, we already mentioned that New Orleans fired their head coach. Could we see Alvin Kamara on the move during the trade deadline? Now, his name has been in the rumor mill for weeks, so it would not be surprising. It could be a fun trade deadline here by the end of the week. How about it's time for the Giants to move on from Daniel Jones? Now, Daniel Jones, he just isn't the long-term answer in New York, and I think anyone, even Giants fans, see that at this point. So how long are they going to let this experiment last? He's 24, 43, and 1 since the 2019 season. He hasn't had over 15 passing touchdowns in a year since 2019, but he just had his first passing touchdowns at home since the 2022 season. I mean, things just aren't great. He's not going to be one of those guys that leads the New York Giants to a Super Bowl. Now, I've seen a lot of rumors here as of late that they could give Drew Lock an opportunity here second half of the season. Now, is Drew Lock the long-term answer? No, he's not. But I wouldn't be surprised if they wanted to see what he could do in this offense, at least leading up to next year's NFL draft. Next thing, I am more excited about the future of Drake May and Bo Nix than I am of Caleb Williams. And honestly, I just don't understand why he gets so many excuses. I mean, what are we trying to make excuses for? Oh, his offensive line isn't any good. It's funny. Neither was CJ Stroud's last year. Oh, well, his coaching staff, they're just plain bad. Well, why weren't they bad a couple games earlier in the season when Caleb Williams actually had a couple good games? We can't just pick and choose excuses. Be realistic. The guy is struggling considering the weapons he has at his disposal. Because if you watch Bo Nix or Drake May each and every week, they're giving their teams a chance to win. They're improving the players around them, and they're doing it with weapons that are nowhere near the level of what Caleb Williams has. But on top of all that, you see there's some locker room issues in Chicago. And that right there, to me, is very telling of a rookie quarterback. If we're only through 9 weeks of the season and some of the teammates are already getting a little bit perturbed, that's a little bit of a problem. Because you see the guys around Drake May and Bo Nix rallying around their rookie quarterbacks. They see something. They give them a chance to win each and every week. It really makes me think this: if Bo Nix or Drake May were to have the same exact weapons as Caleb Williams, what kind of numbers would they be putting up? And honestly, it excites me maybe a little bit more. And then lastly, Derrick Henry is on pace for his best season ever. And where are all the people all off season long that said Derrick Henry was just old, he was washed, there was no tread left on the tires? We just finished week 9 of the season and he already has 1,145 total yards and 13 total touchdowns. He's on pace for 2,163 total yards and 23 total touchdowns. Oh yeah, and he's on pace to do it in 60 touches less than he did in his career year of 2020. There were a lot of teams that had a chance to go Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley in the first 2 picks of their fantasy football drafts. And if there's any teams out there that actually did that, they're probably sitting pretty right now. I just can't get over the fact that people thought Derrick Henry was going to struggle in Baltimore. But anyway, those are 5 things we learned here this past week. And how about the teams that are going to be on bye in week 10? And we have a couple fantasy relevant guys that won't be out there. We have the Browns that are going to be on bye. No Jameis Winston, no Nick Chubb, Cedric Tillman, David Njoku not going to be available here this week. How about the Packers? Jordan Love, he needs a little bit of rest to get healthy. Josh Jacobs, Jaden Reed, Tucker Kraft, they won't be available here in week 10 for the Raiders. It's really just Brock Bowers. That's all we really care about when it comes to fantasy football. And then the Seahawks, Kenneth Walker, maybe Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. So now that we've wrapped up week 9, we've talked about who's not going to be playing in week 10. Let's go ahead and dive into the waiver wire, and let's start off at the quarterback position. Now, if you were reliant on a Geno Smith or a Jordan Love, you can pick up Russell Wilson in a pretty decent matchup going up against Washington, who allows over 16 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Then we also got Matthew Stafford. He's currently 57% owned going up against Miami, and second half Stafford just hits a little bit different. Back-to-back games with at least 275 yards passing, 6 total touchdowns over his last 2 weeks played, and he didn't even have Puka Nacua for half of his game in week 9. Now, over the last couple weeks, we've seen Miami's defense struggle against the likes of Kyler Murray and Josh Allen. Matthew Stafford with Puka back should be able to hit once again. How about Aaron Rodgers of the Jets? He's currently 48% owned. He's going up against the Arizona Cardinals and was last week the turning point for the Jets offense. Adams and Wilson should be absolutely unstoppable each and every week. There's no team out there that can really contain both of those guys. So it's really on the shoulders of Aaron Rodgers to deliver them clean balls. And in a matchup going up against Arizona, they allow over 17.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Aaron Rodgers has had at least 17 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played. He's on the verge of being a top 12 overall quarterback on the season, and he's outscored the likes of CJ Stroud. Got to give him a little bit more credit. And then Justin Herbert, who, makes me feel a little bit fancy right now. He's currently 46% owned going up against Tennessee, and the passing attempts and yardage are starting to creep up in Los Angeles. 3 straight games now with at least 275 yards passing, has 4 passing touchdowns over his last 2 games. Now a matchup going up against Tennessee. They allow over 16 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Justin Herbert becomes an option in week 10. Now after him, we need to go over to the running back position, and there's not a lot out there on the waiver wire as of right now. The first guy up is Isaac Guerendo of the San Francisco 49ers, currently only 16% owned in a matchup going up against Tampa Bay. And really, this has everything to do with Christian McCaffrey. He's supposed to return this week, but supposed to and is are 2 different things. But more importantly than that, if he does return this week, do we really expect him to go out there in his first game back and get 20 plus touches? With the way that we saw Isaac Guerendo play prior to their bye week last week, you have to think that he's earned a few touches weekly. And even if CMC does return, he could be on a limited role, leaving Isaac Guerendo opportunities in an offense that needs some playmakers. Like we've mentioned, San Francisco's coming off the bye week. We knew that Jordan Mason was not 100% healthy heading into the bye week, so Guerendo, somewhat interesting. We really need to wait and see until later in the week if he's actually an option for this week, but as a stash, I don't hate it. Another stash, how about Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens, only 14% owned in a matchup going up against Cincinnati this week, and it could be his first week back coming off the torn ACL last year. Now, honestly, I'm not expecting much, if anything, from him here in week 10, but as a second half of the season stash, I'm all for it. His volume probably isn't going to be there, but it wasn't really there last year either. He's kind of just really one of those big play guys that doesn't need a whole lot of volume because he's so efficient. We'll kind of stash him till the end of the season and see what happens. What about Khalil Herbert of the Chicago Bears? Right now, he's only 9% owned in a matchup going up against New England, and honestly, this one right here is a pure speculative ad. With the trade deadline looming and DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson getting the bulk of the work in this backfield, Khalil Herbert could easily be dealt by the Chicago Bears. Now, he's never really got the respect he deserves, but when he's gotten a chance in the past, he has produced, so he could find himself on another team with a late season role. Let's just see what happens with him. We can always drop him if he doesn't get traded this week. And then lastly, we got to talk about Audric Estime of the Denver Broncos. He's currently 5% owned in a matchup going up against Kansas City here this week, and he's really earned a bigger role in this offense. That's actually come out publicly here from Sean Payton this week that he's going to get a larger role. He's averaged 6.3 yards per carry on the season, but hasn't had a game yet this year with more than 5 carries. Now, he is not some immediate start in week 10, especially going up against Kansas City. They're arguably the best overall run defense in the league. Now, just because he's not going to be immediately start worthy for your fantasy football team doesn't mean he's not worth adding. At this time of the year, when the colder months are right around the corner, teams really tend to run a little bit more. Teams like Denver. So if he can build some momentum, he may be a flex-worthy option late in the season. If you have the bench room available, he's not a bad option here in week 10. But there's really not much else out there for the running back position. Let's go ahead and move on to wide receivers. And at the top of the list, I put Juwan Jennings. Now, yes, he is owned in 60% of leagues, so he may not be out there for a lot of people, but he was injured prior to their bye week and then did not play last week because of the bye week. So there may be some leagues out there where he was dropped. If you happen to play in one of those leagues, he needs to be a priority ad for you. Don't forget, Brandon Ayuk is done for the year. Juwan Jennings is going to have that increased role anytime he's on the field and healthy. How about Demarcus Robinson of the Los Angeles Rams? He's currently 21% owned going up against Miami. Really mentioned him now for a couple weeks in a row in this show. I even started him in one of my leagues last week, and it definitely paid off. Now has back-to-back games with 2 receiving touchdowns. The targets may be a little bit lower when both Puka and Kupp are on the field, but the targets that we're seeing go the way of Demarcus Robinson are producing fantasy points. They're looking for him in the red zone. They're looking for him down the field, and opposing defenses are so consumed with Kyren Williams and Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, he's getting single coverage all over the place. So if he's still out there on your waiver wire, he's definitely worth a spot. I actually like Demarcus Robinson so much, I'm going to make him my Turtle Beach pickup of the week. Now, it's absolutely crazy that it's already November 1st. It's time to start shopping for Christmas presents. But with everything being so freaking expensive right now, you gotta find things on a discount. And that's really where Turtle Beach comes in. They don't just have amazing headsets, they have every gaming accessory you could possibly want. Plus, they're high quality and the prices don't break the bank. They even have racing simulators, flight simulators, keyboards, mice, headphones, whatever it is you need, Turtle Beach is the ultimate gaming cheat code. That's why you need to head to turtlebeach.com right now and use promo code Headliners at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Buy yourself a Christmas present. Go buy someone else a Christmas present and get it for 10% off. That's right, once again, that's 10% off your order at turtlebeach.com with promo code Headliners. But all right, next guy. How about Calvin Austin of the Pittsburgh Steelers? He's only 4% owned right now, going up against the Washington Commandos. And is this Russell Wilson's new Tyler Lockett in this offense? Because he's getting plenty of big play opportunities here with the Pittsburgh Steelers. We already knew that he was an absolute burner, but now a matchup going up against Washington, who allows almost 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And Calvin Austin really seems to be the team's wide receiver too, as of right now. What about Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys? He's only 36% owned going up against Philadelphia. And with the injury to CeeDee Lamb, you have to think that more targets are going to go the way of Jalen Tolbert. Now, it may end up being Cooper Rush delivering those targets if Dak Prescott can't play. But at this point, targets are targets. In an upcoming game going up against Philadelphia, they're going to have to throw the ball. It's still one of the worst running teams in the NFL, and the Philadelphia defense is hard to run on. Jalen Tolbert in line possibly for 8+ targets in Week 10. How about Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers? He's 28% owned as of right now going up against Tennessee, coming off probably his best overall game of the season, his first 100-yard game of the year as well. Now, LA has started to throw the ball a lot more here over the last couple of weeks, and we see that in this offense, Quentin Johnston has the most consistent touchdown upside weekly. What about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine? Now, he's only 2% owned right now going up against the Los Angeles Chargers, and if you're a member on this channel, we talked about him last week in a members-only video. So if you saw that video, grabbed him and started him, you were probably pretty happy with his performance. But now he has a touchdown in 4 straight ball games. Volume isn't going to be huge in this offense, but on a team with minimal weapons, he's getting touchdown looks every single week. If you're desperate for a wide receiver, he's an option. How about Adam Thielen as well? He's currently 37% owned going up against the New York Giants, and they're going to have their game in Germany in Week 10. Now, is that an ideal return date for Adam Thielen? No, but as a seasoned veteran, I don't hate it as much, especially with Deontay Johnson gone and Xavier Leggett kind of banged up right now. We could see the connection of Bryce Young and Adam Thielen happen once again. We saw it a lot in 2023. Now, is this something where I want to pick up Adam Thielen and throw him directly into my lineup? No, probably not. But let's not also forget that for the first half of 2023, Adam Thielen was like a Verge top 15 overall fantasy wide receiver with Bryce Young just being his binky. So if you're looking for a wide receiver, here's a few names that may be out there on your waiver wire. All right, let's dive into the tight end position. And when it comes to tight ends, I got 3 on the list. We got Mike Gesicki, Taysom Hill, and Jatavian Sanders. Now, for Mike Gesicki, he's only 21% owned as of right now in a matchup coming up against Baltimore. The biggest thing that has been holding back Mike Gesicki is the targets that have been going the way of rookie tight end Eric All. We talked about him at the beginning of the show. He's torn his ACL. He's done, which means more targets going the way of Mike Gesicki. Now a matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow over 10 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Then we have Taysom Hill. He's 31% owned going up against Atlanta. We know that Chris Olave is hurt. He's probably going to miss a couple of weeks. Rashid Shaheed is done for the year. Bub Means, he's on IR, and Alvin Kamara is on the trading block. We could be in line for some big-time Taysom Hill volume in the upcoming weeks. If you can add him and play him as your tight end, I don't hate it. Then we got Jatavian Sanders of the Carolina Panthers going up against the New York Giants. He's had at least 5 targets now in 4 of his last 5 games played, and at least 7 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. He's an option. He's not necessarily a safe option, but Carolina is going to have places to throw the football. If you're in a pinch, in a deep league without a tight end, Jatavian Sanders in Week 10 could be an option. Now, for those of you that need to stream a defense here in Week 10, there are 2 options out there that I kind of like that are widely available. How about the New York Giants? They're only 6% owned, and they're going up against the Carolina Panthers. Now, typically, international games get ugly more times than not, and Carolina is still one of the worst overall offenses in the NFL. I really expect this game to be pretty low scoring. And then the Atlanta Falcons. They're only 9% owned going up against New Orleans. And this one right here is really more about the matchup because they have no one to really throw the ball to in New Orleans. If Atlanta can get a lead, I can see Derek Carr trying to force things down the field to play catch up, which turns turns into a couple turnovers that will benefit the Atlanta defense. So if you need to stream a defense, those two should be out there in most leagues. Now, let's talk about a few players that I'm okay with dropping now in week 10 of fantasy football. The first one, I'm surprised to see that Ezekiel Elliott was even 30% owned still. He was a healthy scratch on the worst running team in the NFL. That's not a good sign. He can be dropped. How about Rashad Bateman? He's 35% owned. A lot of people have had a lot of hype for Rashad Bateman every time he's supposed to have an opportunity, and he always disappoints. Now with Deontay Johnson adding into the mix here in week 10, Rashad Bateman probably not going to be a thing. How about Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans? He's 65% owned. Really hasn't been a thing consistently in this offense, even with the injuries to Stephon Diggs and Nico Collins. Now that Nico is scheduled to come back and Dalton Schultz really doesn't see a whole lot of touchdown opportunities, I would much rather have the likes of Taysom Hill or Mike Gesicki here going forward if you need another tight end. And then lastly, Zach Moss of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's 73% owned, and really between him being banged up, not 100% healthy, and Chase Brown playing great football right now, the role for Zach Moss is just so diminished, which is going to go ahead and get us through the waiver wire here for week 10. Now, as you can see with all the injuries and bye weeks, the waiver wire is getting pretty thin. If you look at your overall roster of your fantasy football team, and right now you're like week to week and surviving based off of what's on the waiver wire, the next few weeks may be a little bit rough for you. Really, the best advice that I can give you, just chase volume. Try to find guys who are getting opportunities. If you do that, at least you're setting yourself up for potential success. Now, if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor, hit the like button if you haven't already, and consider subscribing. Even though it's already week 10 of the fantasy football season, if you need a fantasy football home, there's nowhere better than Headliner Nation. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place. I'm a headliner.